think for many of us who play what I'd call, say, non-mainstream games, whether it's war games or fantasy games, heavy cardboard, 18xx, whatever you do off the mainstream, there's a moment that you can look back and say, this was the game that brought me to where I am now. This was the game that I bought that wasn't Monopoly or Risk or whatever. And for me, that game was this game. It was DeathMaze, and this from 1979. It's a Greg Costikyan design, and I picked it up. It was the first game that I bought that was off the mainstream, and I got it probably, I didn't get it in 79, I'm sure. This was my copy. I bought it new. I can't really remember where, but there was a game store where I ended up getting a bunch of games from the late 70s, early 80s, probably in the mid 80s, and that's when I got this. And this, along with Invasion of the Air Eaters, which I picked up in the same place and which I talked about in the video that I did on that, were really what set me down the path that I still continue on decades later in playing these kinds of games. And what was so cool about DeathMaze for me, first of all, you can see here some of the counters for the characters, if I can get that into focus, that there were women that you could play. So here's the female wizard. Every character in the game came with a female counterpart. So there was a female hero, and here she is. She looks like a little, I always thought she looked like a little colonial woman, but whatever, I mean, that was a big deal. And honestly, sadly, in a way, it still is a big deal. I think to have that as an opportunity to play all women. Here's the thief character. I mean, the characters are the same. It's just the counters that they give you with the women on there, and that was really fantastic to me. The other thing that really grabbed me, of course, was that in this game, which we'll see, and maybe those of you watching already know, is simply created. It's a dungeon crawl that's simply created. You make your map out of these counters. There are carders and room counters. There are doors, and then there are rooms that have things in them, like this statue and a fountain where you're rolling on tables to see what you get in there, and you move through. You roll for any monsters you might encounter. I mean, they're pretty standard. Here's a vampire bat counter that you could encounter. And there's even evil heroes. And the dark side of the heroic party that you're traveling with. Here is a giant ant. And I'll just show you a couple more. Here's a giant spider right here. And what else do we have here? This crocodile, or what is they call it, an alligator. It was always kind of a little black, hard to decipher art on that one. But the rules of play are really basic, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through them in detail. You'll just see as I play it out. But in essence, it is, it's an RPG-like. You're moving through with a party with characters that you control, and if you're playing it solo, you would want to be playing probably 4 to 6 characters and pulling these chits to create the dungeon as you go. And then as you move through, pretty standard tropes. Every time you move into an unvisited area, you're going to see whether there is a trap in the door or whether there are wandering monsters. And if you encounter these monsters, you're going to, well, this is the evil hero, but that's a monster too. You're going to need to fight them and have combat and continue on. The goal of this game is to move through and create this dungeon and then collect experience points and collect, in essence, money points. They have a name. The money has a name in this game, that Bizant. But you collect those points And then when you get a certain amount of those for each character, you have to retrace your steps and get out of the death maze alive with those points, and you're meant to carry them on to the next adventure, and then you can sort of trade them in to level up your character. So it is meant as a campaign game in that way. I didn't ever play it that way, and I'm not going to demonstrate it that way here. What I did is use the collection of experience points and money points that you get when you successfully defeat a monster to allow you to upgrade a die roll for a future encounter, so that you're keeping a running track of, I'll show you this when we do the demonstration of the play, a running track of the points you accrue, because once you get these certain points, you are going to exit, because that's the sort of timing mechanism for ending the game, but you're also spending those points during the game so that as you move through the dungeon, you can use them to upgrade your die roll and perhaps be more successful in future combat. In the original rules, the combat basically goes to the death, so you are encountering monsters and you must continue to fight until the monster or your party is killed. I always found that very laborious and never played that way after, the first time I played that way. And what I do is have the ability to inflict wounds on the monster and then leave that area, so the wounded monster is continuing to wander around wherever you encountered him. So on your way back, you may have to deal with him, or you will have to deal with him again, but that you can continue to move on, collecting treasures and spells and all the kinds of typical tropes that you would expect to find in a dungeon crawl, and use these as you go through and encounter the new traps and the new monsters. And then because you have your running total, when you get the requisite amount for all your members of your party, you can then start to retrace your steps and exit your dungeon to end the game. Now, of course, if you've left a monster behind, you're going to encounter a wounded, bloody, angry monster coming back where you left him, and you will need to encounter him again. That is the sort of extent of the overview I'm going to do here. I'll just say one more thing, that there are a product of its time, some of the things you can encounter. It's probably the only game I know where you get cannabis as one of the rewards. There's a spice table that you can roll on, and encountering or picking up certain spices that you can use with certain effects. There's mustard and sesame and spinach and red pepper and good old cannabis. So welcome to the 70s for that. There are traps, there are gems, and potions and magic, and again, this is very, very reminiscent of, and obviously based upon, very standard dungeon crawl tropes that would be familiar to anyone who played D&D or anything like that, but this is played using these counters and creating the dungeon and the map as you go along. DeathMaze was the basis for Citadel of Blood, which came out shortly after it. That's another game that I own. It's more in, there's more to it. There's been a lot added to it, but I may do a video on that as well. But for me, I wanted to do DeathMaze first because, first of all, I had it first, and second of all, it really holds a special place in my heart because of the role that it played in my young gaming life. Now, in 1980, in Moves magazine, there was an sort of, I guess, a more or less official game expansion published for DeathMaze called Roll Up for the Mystery Tour. And I never played this with the original, but it does add in some new character classes. There's a healer and a witch hunter, and some additional, basically, expansions to the treasure and things that this statue table. So I'll probably be using that for the game that I demonstrate here. But this is a little bit not part of the original. But everything else I have here is from the original game. This is a copy of my rules because my rules themselves are sort of fragile, and I don't want to ruin them by using them. But these are my original counters, and they've really held up excellently over the years if you figure how old this game is. So we're going to take a look at DeathMaze. We'll look at my party, and we'll get going into the dungeon. Usually when I play this game, I just make my notes on a piece of paper, but I'm trying to be a little more organized for the video. So I downloaded this fan-made party sheet to keep track of the characters, and we'll see how it goes here. I'm playing 6 characters, and one thing about this sheet, while it's nice that it's all on one page, it gives a false sense that this might be the marching order of the party, which it's not going to be, and I'll show you that as we get going. What I'm playing here is our 2 heroes and a thief, a wizard, and I am picking up 2 of the priest heroes from the expansion that I mentioned. One is a witch hunter and one is a peacemaker. We'll just quickly look at, there's a very basic creation here. When you start out, you're given most of the values. You're not really rolling up characters, you're just taking the values. So, for example, the hero comes with 8 wound points to start, a magic resistance of 1, and we'll get into that. They each get to select a weapon, and the weapons I've chosen, they're pretty limited. I've chosen a sword for 1 and an axe for 1. And the thief gets a special D-trap skill, which is here. I'm having him wielding an axe. He's got a health of 6 to start. And the wizards start with a magic resistance of 2. And they have limitations in terms of what weapons they can carry. They can only carry a throwing dagger, which I've given this wizard. I see I failed to get a spell for her, so we'll do that. And then my 2 priests have the some special abilities that I've noted here, and I assigned this one, the witch hunter, a bow, and this peacemaker cannot carry a weapon, so I wrote NA there to remind myself of that. And he will get a special ability on the negotiation table, the monster negotiation table. He's going to get a benefit, and also I've assigned a couple of spells to him per the rules. There are counters for your party members, as I mentioned here, and the reason I'm using these little blocks is because since I am using the priest, the expansion characters, there are no priest counters, so I need to use these wizard counters and keep track of who's who. So my witch hunter, wizard, and this is going to have special interaction with the undead monsters that we will encounter, is going to be signaled by a red cube, and the peacemaker by a white cube. And then also I've got my male and female hero, but just to keep things consistent, I'm using cubes for these 2. So one of the first things you do after creating this basic stats for your characters in the party is to set up the marching order, and there are some rules about that. One of them being that you can only have 3 across per row, and also in the first row they're going to be the first encounters. They must use melee weapons, so I'm choosing to put both of my heroes and my thief, who I've given sword, axe, and sword and 2 axes to, in the first row. My wizard here is going to be coming in on the second row, who has a throwing dagger, so that is going to be in play. The characters, any characters in the third row, cannot initially conduct any combat. So I'm going to have just these 2 rows here, and then put my peacemaker, who doesn't have a weapon anyway, into the third row. So this is going to be my initial marching order for the party. And again, when I have this set up, I'm going to just keep it on the, so we know who is who. That was my plan at any rate, to differentiate these, here, making a mess of it already, to differentiate these same chits to indicate who is who. There is, again, no initial map setup because you're drawing the tiles, so what you're instructed to do is to place, there are 3 different types of tile counters. There are the ones that indicate rooms, and there are also ones that have special rooms. There are empty corridor tiles such as this, and then within this room cup there are also corridor tiles that are labeled, or I should say there are also counters that are labeled corridor. So when you pull one of these from the room cup with the rest of the rooms, it is instructing you instead to pull a card or cup. Or excuse me, a card or counter. So these are the two cups from which you're pulling. This one's kind of full, so I just kind of give it a shake every now and then to make sure that there's some randomization here. All right, we'll just take a closer look here at some of the variety. I know I showed you a couple of counters before, a variety of things you can encounter in your dungeon and what the values on the counters mean before we actually get going in here. You know, it's pretty standard stuff. You have your giant ant, well, here's standard, ogre, goblin, there's a Medusa that can come in. You have some undead characters here, and they're going to be focusing on my witch hunter, mummies, skeletons, vampire bats. We have orcs, and these are the evil versions of us. So here's the evil thief on top, and we have evil wizards and things of that nature. Kronks, there's the vampires, I don't know if I mentioned that, hellhounds, and here's that alligator I showed you from before. In terms of the values on these counters, they are all the same, you know, for all the different monsters. And here we'll look a little closer like this to show how we read them and understand what they are. All right, let's take a look here at this giant spider, for example. We've got obviously the picture of the monster and the name of the monster. Then this value here, the 2 and the 0, what this means is it is ultimately the health or the wound points of that monster that you encounter. So it's going to be variable. So not all the giant spiders, for example, will end up with the same. The first number tells you how many six-sided dice you roll, and then there is a modifier to it to obtain the health value of that. So here, of course, the maximum is going to be 12, but some of them, for example, this gargoyle is going to be stronger because you'll be rolling 3d6 and adding 1 to that value. There is one at least that where you're rolling, there's a half point value where you're just basically rolling a d3. You can't find it right now. You need to keep track of this because if you're playing my way and you come back to a room and the monster is still there, you've got to remember, you know, what the deal is with it. So I'm also going to be drawing my dungeon along the way to keep track of that. You'll see that as we go. The number on the upper left here is the combat bonus, and some of the, for example, this goblin here, you'll see has a W here. This means he's carrying a weapon, and there is a chart that will tell you what weapon the goblin is carrying, and then to determine how that impacts combat, you'll be referring to the same weapon table that is in play for the characters in the party. But for those monsters that do not have a weapon, you need to come up with their attack value, and this is a modification number. There's a little procedure you go through using some tables and then using this number as a modifier to determine how many wound points they're going to be dealing in combat. And when we go through a combat example, I'll show you how that works out. So this represents everything you can encounter. And then the final thing I'll show you here, again, not really necessary to play the game at all, or definitely not necessary to play the game, but something that I'm using for this demonstration, and which I do use other times, are some counters from other games, or some, you know, game things from other games to track my experience. Some of you may recognize this from Mage Knight. This is to track my experience that I gain, the money that I gain, and the wound points. And we're going to be trading in the experience and the money to do some upgrades during the course of the game. But as I mentioned, I also need to keep track a running total. So I've got my piece of paper here where I will be keeping track in a running total of how much experience and how much money I'm accruing as we go through, because when we get to a certain point, we're going to get to start to go back to exit the dungeon and ultimately, hopefully, win the game. The final thing I'll say is that when you're in the final thing I'll say right now is that when you're in the dungeon, you are having your party marked by these party markers. Really, you're just meant to be using one party marker here. But I play where you can split the party up at the end if you're coming back out, and there are actually 2 party markers in the original game. And the individual character counters are used off the side to deal with combat in terms of how you have your marching order and which monster is fighting which character. This is what things look like a couple of corridors and rooms in, and again I'm using a whole bunch of accoutrement that you don't really need to play this game, which is partially what's so cool about the game, because all you really need is this teeny tiny little thing that you can play on a clipboard. But I will show you, we're about to do some combat with some orcs that we encountered. We entered here, this was just a random pull of a corridor. We went through a corridor, and when you're entering, of course, you're testing for wandering monsters. We determined there was nothing there. There's no special features or anything in this room, so we continued on. We decided we wanted to go into a room, which means we need to test to see if the door has a trap, and it did not. And we entered this room. Now, there's nothing special about this room, but we did do our wandering monster test, and we encountered 2 orcs. And we'll take a look here at the situation as we're going to be facing these orcs. Now, when you encounter monsters, you can negotiate with them if you want, and if you're successful in your negotiation, they will leave you alone and run away. This is something that you want to do if you've entered a room that you want to investigate further. So there are rooms that have some special features in them. This does not, but if that is the case, you would want to use some negotiation if you possibly could. Now, you remember I'm playing with this expansion character of the Peacemaker, and that special ability for him is he has an additional bonus on the negotiation table. He can't carry any weapons, but he's going to help you successfully negotiate with monsters. However, we don't need to do that now. We're going to conduct some combat and see what happens. Now, off camera, I rolled up. Remember, for the monster strength, you need to take this number here, the 1 plus 2. So the first number represents how many d6s you roll, and then the second number is what you add to that roll to get the wound total for the orc. So for this orc here, I rolled a 4, so he's got a strength of 6. And for this other fellow, I rolled happily a 1, so he's got a strength of 3. Now, I mentioned to you that I do need to keep track off camera, and this is how I do it, where I am and where the monsters are, because in the game that I'm playing, I can leave some wounded monsters behind and move on if I so choose, but I have to get back through this room to win the game, and they are going to be, they're not going to be exiting the room that they are left in because they're, too wounded to do that. So I need to keep some track of that. We have our party set up to combat these orcs, and this is the orc with the 6 strength, and this is the orc with the 3 strength, and the basic sequence is you're going to do all your combat and inflicting of wounds, and then they're going to do theirs, and back and forth until they're dead or you're dead, or in the case of my game, you leave them behind. Now, a couple of points to reiterate. The characters each are carrying 2 weapons, and the ones in the second row need to be using ranged weapons. So they have their bows and arrows, or they have daggers that they can throw from the second position only. And again, this fellow here, I left him in the second row, but he has no weapons at all. So in this combat, he is useless because we've decided not to negotiate. So basically what happens is we move across, and our hero here is going to choose to use his sword against this orc. He has a +1 modifier on it, and you're doing a basic d6 roll, which I'll do here. And based on that roll, you then, let's see if I can sort of pull this in here. So we got a 4 there, +1 is a 5. We go to our Very basic CRT here, coming down the column showing the sword and the die roll of a 5. We got a 1, and that inflicts 1 wound, and actually he would have been successful even without that modifier, if you look there. So he inflicted 1 wound on that orc. You're going to keep track of that, and you're going to basically move across. The hero here has an axe that he's going to use. He's got his +1 modifier on that. And whoops, he's going to roll. He also rolled a 4, actually. And, well, it's the same. Actually, it's the same result there. The sword, the hammer, and the axe are all the same. So he's also going to inflict 1 wound. So this orc now is carrying 2 wounds of the 6. Now, this fellow, the thief here, is going to be attacking the 3 strength orc, and he has no modifications to his weapons. He's got a bow as well as an axe, and the reason that he doesn't have modifications is that I chose instead to boost his detrapping skill, because the thief is what you need to get into those doors if they should be locked. So he's going to be using his bow, and we will do the roll here. It's just hard for me to show you this on, well, I'm not showing it on camera, but I rolled a 3 there, and let's check that out. The bow, a 3, that is a miss. So he missed with his bow, and we will continue on and see what happens. All right, so after our phase, what happened was this orc the 6 orc went down to 2, so he's bleeding and battered, but that wily orc that started just with 3 health was not hit. So we have now all done excuse me, our attacks, and it is the monster side of things. And again, I'm not going to show you this off camera. It's not on camera. It's not terribly interesting, but I will point out this. It's the same CRT, and there is the monster column there that you read down for your results. There are, in the advanced rules, which I am playing, there are certain special abilities that certain monsters have, and I keep track of this here on my first page, just referring to the rules. Now, the orcs don't have any, but were we encountering any of these or the evil wizard, there would be special rules that we would need to refer to for combat. But this is just a straight read of that table, and again, it parries back and forth as it goes, and we'll see where we end up. Before I do that, just a point of correction. I realize I keep calling these guys orcs. They're actually ogres, because if they were orcs, and I have to find the orc counter, if they were orcs, they would be wielding weapons themselves. And what we would see in place of this number 4 is we would see a value of a W, and then we would be referring to the monster weapons chart. But instead, we're using that 4 value to be a modifier on this CRT to come up with their weapons. So I don't know why I keep calling them orcs, but we're actually encountering ogres here, not orcs. Well, where we ended up was not great. I kept fighting and fighting, and this orc here, the one on the right, the one with just the 3 health, was one. That was one to go down last and inflict a lot of wounds. Here's how it kind of looks messy at the end. But as you can see, our frontline party members took a lot of wounds. This had a health of 8, took 4 wounds. Ditto, and took 3 wounds. I've mentioned this before, but when I film, I kind of sometimes forget certain basic things about the game, and you can do a reorganization of the party in between rounds of combat, which I probably should have done to distribute the wounds a little more evenly. I did not do that. I had also given my wizard, he has some armor, or she has some armor, and that would have absorbed some of the wounds if they had been on the front line. But be that as it may, this is what happened. And I do have, my wizard has a healing spell, and this healing spell is a non-combat spell, which means it can be used between rounds of combat to heal members of the party. Each spell comes with a spell cost, and the spell cost is in health points. So this number here, this 2, means that for the wizard to use her healing spell on someone else, she's going to have to take 2 wound points. So she can, in effect, I think she can go down to 0. I have to confirm that. She certainly can't go beyond 0. She may be able to go down to 0 and heal 2 wounds, but we'll be able to probably heal up by getting some things, because again, this is why we were fighting these monsters, because we want to see what treasure they are carrying. And I'll just walk you through a little bit of how you determine that, and then we'll sort of move on from this level of detail, because this game does have a lot of dice rolling and chart looking up to get things or to make things happen, and this is no exception. So what happens is you've got when you defeat the monster, so as I continue on, I just turn the counter upside down to indicate that it's been defeated, but both of these have been defeated, these ogres. You are then starting to look up on the various tables to see what are they carrying. Well, why are we doing this? Why are we going through all this? We're doing this to get experience and money, and I'm showing you here the experience rules from the game. Basically, what you're doing is you are tallying the number of wound points that the monsters had prior to combat, which in this case was a total of 9. You're multiplying that number by 6, and then you're dividing it by the number of adventurers who remain at the end of combat. So in this case, it's basically 9 times 6 divided by 6, because everybody still remains, even though some of us are wounded, and that is the number of experience points that is distributed among the crew. So everybody here got 9 experience points for this combat, but that's not all you get. And of course, this is really the heart of the game, and why, despite the fact that this is just a bunch of basically two-color counters and a black and white rule book, for me anyway, it just becomes really imaginative and fun, and I can get involved in it when I'm not filming, in a way that it flows very easily despite all the lookups. And that is what happens next. Is you're going to get your loot. You're going to raid these monsters and see what they have to offer you. You do that by looking up their characteristics on this chart. We were fighting these ogres, and we see in the second column this I/C. That is referring us to the treasure type, and we're going to the treasure type table and noticing here that we have under I, this is going to offer us money, gems, and magic items. And it's not so simple. You don't just get something. You have to do something to get something. Unfortunately, the treasure in I is going to be in a chest, and that chest could potentially be trapped or locked. So we need to do a test for that. Assuming we get something in there, we then need to do another test against this number of 6 to see whether we can get what's in there. And we're doing some die rolls there, and then we're doing further tests to finally look up and see what magic items we get. And it's not that interesting to do all this on camera, but I want to just point it out, because when you're playing the game, it's, at least I find, there is a lot of die rolling, there's a lot of looking up, but it's exciting. If you like this kind of game, you're excited to see what you roll on the spice table, or will you get a potion. And then, of course, as you progress through the dungeon, I'm just pulling my little dungeon in here. It got messed up already. As you progress through the dungeon, you're carrying more items, and you get to use these items in combat, and that is what multiplies the experience and gives you the sense of progression down into the dungeon, that you are at the very beginning of the game just trying to, you are sort of fighting indiscriminately to get the stuff, and the notion of getting the stuff really makes this game flow and shine. So I'm going to go through now off camera, get into this dungeon, play it through, and see what I get at the end, and come back and show you in a more summary manner what happened. We are a few turns in the game, and it kind of looks crazy here, and I wanted to just take the chance to talk about it a little bit. I'm not sure how much more of the video I'm going to do in terms of playing through the whole game, but we're roughly, I don't know if we're quite midway through. Our party, which is sort of a little decimated here, just encountered this giant ant as a wandering monster in this corridor, and there was a relatively bloody battle here, as you can see the distribution of wounds, and along the way we have picked up a magic item from a fountain that is an armor, and it basically absorbs a wound point, or it gives an extra wound point. You can distribute these among the party, which is pretty nice. And we've gotten a whole bunch of experience because we've had a bunch of bloody battles that I've allowed to go to the end, and you can see the wounds here. Haven't yet used my healing spell from the wizard, but I do plan to do that soon. And part of what happened here, this is what, this is a game of luck. Obviously, there's a lot of dice rolling, and there's only so much you can control, clearly. For me as a player, for a game like this, it goes with the territory. Other games where they are much less luck-based until, the very end of the game and everything comes down to one die roll, that really irritates me. But this is totally thematic. It is a lot of luck, and you just kind of accept that going in, or at least I do. With this annoying giant ant here, it came in with a wound total of 10, and it went down pretty quickly to like 1 health point. It was just hanging on, and then we got a series of really bad die rolls, like for a couple of rounds of combat in our party, where we started to accrue some wounds from this ant that was just hanging on and hanging on, and that's how we built up some wound totals. But where things stand now in terms of our experience, most of us have an experience of 19. Our thief has gained some additional experience because we encountered a couple of traps, and through some good die rolling, the thief was able to, our party here is a little decimated after that fight. But our thief here, she was able to do some good detrapping. So as a result of that, she got some experience reward. So her experience level now is at 39. So that's pretty good. If you remember that when we get to 40, we're sort of on our way out, or at least, when we get to 100, we can be on our way out, or at least if we exit with 100 at the end of the game, we've won. So we could turn around and start to go back at a certain point. Now, your party as a whole, here's sort of how I'm keeping track of these things. Your party as a whole is going to be needing to exit, if they're still alive, with the same criteria of the 100 experience and the 75 money. So you can't just, I had to redo of course this always happens to me, I start at the bottom. You think I learn after all these years, you can't start at the bottom. This is where I am, and this is, a little messy looking here in terms of each of these representing 2 points of experience, 10 points of experience, my money, and my wounds. Again, you do not need any of this to play, and this is what's cool about this game. You really just need this. It is a really small footprint game. It's the kind of game that you can pack up and bring with you. I keep all my counters in this container here. I mean, this is basically the entire game. You do not need to lay out your monsters as the rules suggest to pull from them if you're willing to kind of just either keep them sorted here. The other way you can play the game, there certainly is a lot of dice rolling in this game, clearly. So the other opportunity that you have is to just keep everything in a big container and just randomly pull things out. If you wanted to play that way, you don't need to do the rolling on the table to get the certain monster. I guess I kind of like to do that because in this one, I guess I try to follow the rules if I can, but you certainly didn't need to do that if you didn't want to keep your monsters sorted. You could just pull them out. One last point I want to make about this really annoying ant is that the characteristics on the monsters can vary depending on whether you encounter them. This was a wandering monster we encountered in this corridor. But if the monster type is a room monster, it could have different characteristics. So unfortunately, because this ant was wandering around, all we got was the experience points for killing him. He was not carrying any other loot or magic items or anything, which really kind of stank, because if we encountered the very same ant or another giant ant in a room, his characteristics would be different. So there's some nice variability there where, unless you play the game enough to know what's going on. I mean, I didn't remember that the ant wasn't going to give us more than experience because it was a wandering monster as opposed to a room monster. I guess if you played this a ton in a row, you would remember that. But I didn't, so it was a surprise, not the greatest surprise, but that was a surprise to me, so we didn't pick up any other loot. I mean, what else can I say about this game? The charm of it for me has not diminished in decades, and despite the fact that over the years, of course, I've bought and will continue to buy anything that professes to offer me some type of exploration in a fantasy world and the surprise and immersion of the story coming out as you turn around a dark corner and what will you find there. I mean, I have salivated over all the games, especially recently, all the games that have been published with lush components and art and everything that is an extra that is meant to involve you in a story of some type of exploration and adventure. I mean, that's my thing. I mean, that's one of the things that really draws me to games, especially when you combine that with puzzle elements and choice and decision about how you're going to make it through, and throw in some magic and some combat, and I am happy. But this game, it's like that down to its bare bones. You don't have anything representative of your spells and your items and your potions except this black and white list of, a table, 1.45, etc. But it still works for me. It is something that causes you to imagine things in your mind, and I don't know whether anybody has taken this game and really, the components of this game and kind of done them up in actual miniature versions. Probably they have, and you could play out the mechanics of that with that. But for me, these basic two-color chits and the one color rule book and the simple listing of tables, it really works. I'm able to envision, for example, in this game, my thief who became the hero and was able to gain tons of experience and sort of lead the party through and detrap things and get everybody else magic items and money and all of that. It's easy for me to do that, and I get into my head that way, and playing solo, that works perfectly well. I'm showing you here just the dungeon because, I had a lot of other components when I was doing the video, but really it boils down to this. You can play it on a clipboard, and you can play it with a couple of dice, and that's it. And you're going to need some pen and paper to keep track of things, but it is something that could travel with you. And is it the type of game that I'm going to take out every month? No, I don't do that. I do take it out, I don't know, a couple times a year, maybe once a year, to be honest. I don't know. But every now and then I just think, I just kind of want to go back and do that. I don't have the time to play other X, Y, and Z game that might offer the same or similar type of exploration and that type of satisfaction. I don't have the table space to set it up, whatever. I can set this up and play a little bit of it. It does get a little long. I mean, the combats can get drawn out, even if you play the way I do, where you can leave a combat and leave a wounded monster wandering around there. The game can get pretty long. You're throwing dice a lot, but it also can be easily covered up with another clipboard, and then you can come back to it and pick it up. It's not too hard to remember where you are. So for me, that is a useful thing just in terms of the realities of my life and how much gaming time I have set aside in a row. So that is what I've got to say about DeathMaze. It was, as I said, the one of the two first. I don't know whether I bought DeathMaze at the same time as Invasion of the Air Eaters, like literally the same day, or I certainly bought it at the same period of my life. And this, along with that, brought me to this hobby and really, as a result, enriched my life. Thanks for watching.